The Nexus Prime Military Academy floated in the void like a crystalline monument to organized violence, its bioluminescent spires pulsing with the self-satisfied glow of institutional superiority. For 3 centuries, it had been the galaxy's premier educational establishment for the art of sophisticated warfare, where the finest military minds from 17 different species gathered to study the delicate science of organized destruction. The Academy prided itself on elevating warfare from mere brutality to high art. Gone were the days of crude, emotional conflicts driven by primitive instincts. Here, under the guidance of the galaxy's most enlightened military theorists, warfare was taught as a precise discipline combining mathematics, psychology, and strategic philosophy. The Zephyrian professors, with their 4-dimensional tactical thinking, worked alongside Vorthan strategists, whose crystalline minds could calculate probability matrices that would make quantum computers weep with envy. The curriculum was meticulously crafted, based on centuries of analysis of historical conflicts from across the known galaxy. Case studies ranged from the elegant ethereal consciousness wars to the mathematically beautiful siege of Proxima Centauri. Every battle was dissected, analyzed, and refined into teachable theory. The Academy's crown jewel was its comprehensive database of primitive species combat analysis, a collection of warfare studies from youngest civilizations that served as perfect examples of how not to conduct military operations. Naturally, the Academy had standards. Only the most promising candidates from each species were selected, and even then, the dropout rate was astronomical. The galaxy's military elite couldn't be trained by just anyone, after all. Which made the case of Chen particularly fascinating, if you enjoyed watching institutional arrogance collide with inconvenient reality. Chen sat in the back corner of advanced tactical theory, her expression carefully neutral as Professor Vex Theron droned on about the theoretical applications of urban warfare doctrine. The Zephyrian's voice carried that particular tone of academic superiority that suggested he'd never actually been closer to combat than a holosimulation. Now, observe this primitive tactical scenario, Vex Theron announced, his tentacles manipulating the holographic display with practiced flourishes. Species designation, human. Location, urban environment, Terran colony designated New Jakarta. Note the crude, emotional decision-making processes typical of younger species. The simulation flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional representation of a city under siege. Buildings crumbled in precise mathematical patterns as theoretical forces moved through predetermined scenarios. The defending force, trapped in an urban environment, should logically surrender or negotiate, the professor continued, completely missing Chen's slight grimace. Instead, observe their irrational behavior. Chen watched the sanitized version of a battle she remembered all too well, though the Academy's version bore little resemblance to the actual chaos of that particular Tuesday afternoon. The simulation showed neat tactical movements and logical progressions, while her memory supplied the more accurate details. The smell of burning electronics, the weight of exhaustion after 36 hours without sleep, and the way Sergeant Rodriguez had somehow managed to crack jokes even while rigging explosives in a collapsed subway tunnel. Miss Chen, Professor Vex Theron's voice cut through her recollections like a disapproving blade. Perhaps you'd care to share your analysis of this scenario. Every head in the amphitheater turned toward her. Her classmates, a mix of Vothan tactical prodigies, ethereal strategic savants, and other species military elite, regarded her with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to belly-concealed disdain. The lone human in a class of galactic overachievers, and she was failing spectacularly. The simulation's parameters seem incomplete, Chen said carefully. A ripple of what might charitably be called amusement passed through the class. Professor Vex Theron's eye stalks twitched in what she'd learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a condescending smile. Incomplete. This analysis is based on comprehensive data from multiple sources, cross-referenced and verified by our finest military historians. Are you suggesting that our academic standards are somehow insufficient? Chen glanced at the holographic display again, where neat little tactical icons moved through a choreographed dance of theoretical destruction. The real battle had lasted 4 days. The simulation was programmed to end in 6 hours, with total defeat for the defending forces. I'm suggesting that real combat rarely follows theoretical parameters, she said. Ah. Yes, Vex Theron's voice dripped with academic patience. the human tendency toward emotional decision-making. This is precisely why such primitive approaches fail against organized, logical military strategy. The simulation concluded with the inevitable collapse of human defenses, exactly as the Academy's models predicted. What it didn't show was how the actual battle had ended, with the attacking forces in full retreat and Chen herself being pulled from the rubble of the command post 3 days after officially being declared KIA. But pointing that out would require admitting she'd been there, which would require explanations she wasn't particularly interested in providing. The semester continued in this fashion, with Chen consistently failing simulations based on conflicts that felt oddly familiar. The Battle of Kepler Station, reimagined as a masterclass in why smaller forces shouldn't engage superior numbers. The defense of Europa mining complex, transformed into a cautionary tale about the futility of asymmetric warfare. The Titan Rebellion, sanitized into a neat case study of why guerrilla tactics were ultimately self-defeating. Each time, Chen found herself wanting to raise her hand and mention small details the simulations missed. Like how the defenders of Kepler Station had actually won by doing exactly what the Academy's models said was impossible. Or how the Europa mining complex hadn't fallen. It had become the launching point for the largest prisoner rescue operation in recent history. Or how the Titan Rebellion hadn't been crushed by superior military doctrine, but had ended with a negotiated settlement that granted the outer colonies unprecedented autonomy. But Chen had learned to keep such observations to herself. Her professors had made it clear that her emotional perspective was precisely the kind of thinking that proper military education was designed to overcome. The final straw came during her last examination, a comprehensive tactical simulation based on what Professor Vextharon proudly announced were the most thoroughly documented example of primitive warfare in our database. The scenario involved a human military unit trapped in hostile territory, cut off from support, facing overwhelming odds. Chen recognized it immediately. She also knew exactly how it had actually ended, partly because she'd been there, and partly because she'd written the after-action report that was apparently now serving as source material for the Academy's theoretical models. The simulation began, and Chen found herself commanding a virtual version of her own former unit, tasked with making decisions she'd already made years ago. Except the Academy's version of events bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened. According to the simulation, her unit should have surrendered after the first day. When she instead ordered them to dig in and prepare defensive positions, the system flagged it as an irrational decision likely to increase casualties. When she directed her virtual soldiers to jury-rig communications equipment from salvage parts, exactly what her real soldiers had done, the simulation informed her that such improvisation was unrealistic given the technical limitations of primitive equipment. When she implemented the flanking maneuver that had actually turned the tide of the real battle, the system simply wouldn't allow it, explaining that the environmental conditions made such tactics theoretically impossible. By the end of the simulation, her virtual unit had been wiped out completely, despite the fact that her real unit had not only survived but had completed the mission with 0 casualties. Chen stared at the result screen showing her comprehensive failure and began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but quickly escalated into the kind of helpless laughter that comes from witnessing something so absurdly ironic that the universe seems to be playing an elaborate practical joke. The other students stared at her with alarm, while Professor Vextharon's eye stalks twitched with disapproval. "Miss Chen, your reaction is entirely inappropriate for a military educational environment," he said sternly. "I'm sorry," Chen managed between gasps of laughter. "It's just, you're absolutely right. Humans really are terrible at warfare." 3 days later, she received her official notice of academic dismissal. The document was written in the galaxy's standard diplomatic language, which allowed the administration to express their disappointment in her performance while maintaining the polite fiction that this was somehow for her own good. The notice explained that while the Academy appreciated her unique perspective, it had become clear that human cognitive patterns were simply incompatible with advanced military theory. The board suggested she might find more suitable opportunities in civilian sectors, perhaps logistics or maintenance work, where emotional decision-making wouldn't be such a hindrance. Chen read the dismissal notice twice, filed it carefully in her personal storage unit, and began packing. Her belongings fit easily into a single duffel bag. The Academy had strict policies about personal possessions, and she'd never been one for accumulating unnecessary items anyway. As she prepared to leave, she made one small addition to her luggage, a data chip containing her personal files, including her complete military service record. She'd kept it as a memento, though she'd never expected it to be relevant to her academic career. She was almost finished packing when her door chimed. Outside stood Junior Archivist X, a young Vorthan whose crystalline features were currently cycling through colors that indicated extreme agitation. "Miss Chen," Thex said, their voice carrying harmonics of distress. "I need to speak with you. It's about your dismissal." Chen gestured for them to enter, noting the way Thex's chromatic patterns shifted nervously as they stepped inside her sparse quarters. "I was conducting routine database maintenance," Thex began without preamble, cross-referencing our curriculum sources with the Galactic military archives. "Standard procedure, just checking for data corruption or inconsistencies." Chen waited patiently. Vorthans were methodical by nature, and interrupting their explanation process only made them start over from the beginning. "I found correlations," Thex continued, their color patterns now cycling through what Chen had learned indicated profound confusion. "Perfect correlations. Every case study in our primitive warfare curriculum matches exactly with documented Terran military conflicts." Chen kept her expression neutral. "That's not particularly surprising. Human conflicts would naturally be used as examples of primitive warfare." "No, you don't understand." Thex's colors shifted to urgent purple. "They are not examples. They are exact copies. Battle plans, unit designations, tactical decisions, even casualty reports, everything matches perfectly." The Archivist activated a portable holographic display, showing two sets of data side by side. On the left, the Academy's theoretical case studies. On the right, official military records from the Terran Defense Force. "Look at this." Thex highlighted a section of text. "The Academy's analysis of the theoretical defense of New Jakarta. The data source is listed as extrapolated from primitive tactical patterns, but it's actually a direct copy of TDF Combat Report 7731 Alpha." Chen glanced at the report number and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She knew that number by heart. "And here," Thex continued, pulling up another comparison. "The Kepler Station scenario. Our curriculum presents it as a model of why inferior forces inevitably fail against superior strategy, but the actual combat report shows the defenders won decisively." The Archivist's color patterns were now cycling through the full spectrum of Vorthan emotional states, indicating a level of cognitive dissonance that was probably giving them a headache. "Miss Chen," Thex said quietly, "every single theoretical failure in our curriculum corresponds to an actual Terran military victory. And your name appears in the source documents. Repeatedly." Chen looked at the young Archivist for a long moment, noting the way their crystalline features reflected the holographic displays and shifting patterns of light and shadow. "Thex," she said finally, "what exactly do you think is happening here?" "I think," Thex's voice was barely above a whisper, "the Academy has been teaching Terran warfare back to a Terran, using sanitized versions of battles she actually fought in." Chen nodded slowly. "That would be awkward, wouldn't it?" The following morning brought chaos to the Nexus Prime Military Academy's administrative levels. Overnight, Junior Archivist Thex's discovery had propagated through the Academy's entire database system, triggering automated verification protocols that began cross-referencing every piece of curriculum data with external sources. By dawn, the results were unavoidable. The Academy's entire primitive warfare studies program was based exclusively on human military records, most of which documented decisive human victories. The theoretical scenarios used to demonstrate the futility of emotional military thinking were actually case studies in successful unconventional warfare. Professor Vextharan found himself staring at his office display, which currently showed his own lecture notes side by side with their original source, a tactical analysis written by Major Kira Chen, Terran Defense Force, following her unit's successful defense of the Titan mining colony. The same Major Chen who had just been dismissed from his advanced tactics course for failing to understand basic military theory. The emergency faculty meeting convened at 0800 hours, and by 0900, the assembled professors had reached the uncomfortable conclusion that their institution's reputation was built on a foundation of profound academic incompetence. Dean Morthak, whose species specialized in logical analysis, was the first to voice what they were all thinking, We've been teaching humans their own military doctrine incorrectly, and then failing them when they point out our errors. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the Academy's environmental systems, which suddenly seemed to be mocking them. "How many students have we dismissed for similar failures?" asked Professor Killandra, whose own species had contributed 3 expelled humans to the Academy's records over the past decade. The answer, when the database search completed, was worse than anyone had imagined. 17 human students had been dismissed over the past 20 years, each one failing simulations based on conflicts they had actually participated in. "We need to contact Chen immediately," Dean Morthak announced. "Offer her immediate reinstatement, full honors, perhaps a position on the faculty dash." "Sir," interrupted Assistant Dean Vorth, whose nervous energy had been increasing throughout the meeting. "I've been monitoring Galactic communication networks for any mention of our situation. There's something you should see." The main display activated, showing a news feed from the Galactic Commerce Network. The headline read, "Former Military Academy Dropout Revolutionizes Sector Defense Contracts." The report detailed how Chen Security Consulting, a firm founded just months earlier, had rapidly become the most sought-after military contractor in known space. Their success rate in resolving conflicts was unprecedented. Their methods were described as brilliantly unconventional, and their fees were astronomical. The report included an interview with Chen herself, conducted at her company's headquarters, a modest facility that somehow radiated more competence than the Academy's entire campus. "My educational experience at Nexus Prime was quite valuable," Chen was saying, her expression perfectly neutral. "It taught me that there's a significant market demand for practical military solutions." When asked about her dismissal from the Academy, she smiled slightly. "Sometimes the best education comes from learning what doesn't work." The Academy's theoretical approach was certainly educational. The interviewer pressed for details about her rapid success in the private sector. "Well," Chen said, her tone carefully casual, "it turns out that when you've actually fought in the conflicts that other people study as theoretical exercises, you tend to have insights that purely academic analysis might miss." The implications hit the assembled faculty like a cascade of colliding asteroids. "She's been telling everyone," Professor Vextharon whispered, his eye stalks drooping with horror. "Our former student is publicly stating that our curriculum is based on theoretical analysis of battles she actually won." Dean Morthak activated the Academy's priority communication system, sending an urgent message to Chen's company. The response came back within minutes, routed through what appeared to be several layers of automated screening systems. "Chen Security Consulting appreciates your interest in our services. Due to high demand, new client consultations are currently scheduled 18 months in advance. Please note that our minimum contract for educational institutional clients is 50,000 credits per day, with a minimum engagement period of 6 months." The message concluded with a polite suggestion that potential clients might find more suitable assistance from accredited academic institutions with relevant practical experience. Professor Vextharon calculated the proposed fee structure and made a sound that his species typically reserved for imminent death scenarios. "She's charging us more per day than most systems spend on planetary defense. And she's book solid for the next year and a half," added Professor Killandra, whose own species had a cultural appreciation for ironically perfect revenge. The Academy's communication system chimed again, indicating an incoming message from the Galactic Defense Coordination Office. Dean Morthak opened it with a growing certainty that the situation was about to get worse. The message was brief and to the point. The GDCO was conducting a comprehensive review of military educational standards across all member systems. Recent analysis suggested that current training methodologies might not be adequately preparing officers for practical combat scenarios. As part of this review, all military academies would be required to demonstrate the real-world effectiveness of their curricula. The review would be conducted by a panel of experts selected for their practical combat experience rather than academic credentials. The panel's chief consultant was listed as Major Kira Chen, retired, CEO of Chen Security Consulting. The irony was so complete, so perfectly crafted, that Dean Morthak wondered if the universe had developed a sense of humor specifically to torment military educators. 6 months later, the Nexus Prime Military Academy had undergone what the administration carefully termed curriculum modernization. The Primitive Warfare Studies program had been quietly renamed Applied Combat Analysis and was now taught by a rotating faculty of actual combat veterans from various species. The Academy's new teaching methodology emphasized practical experience over theoretical analysis, much to the dismay of professors who had built their careers on never having to test their theories against reality. Chen Security Consulting had opened a training division specifically to sci-fi educational clients, offering intensive courses in reality-based military education. The waiting list was now 3 years long, and the fees had doubled. Professor Vextharan, whose academic career had survived the transition through a combination of desperate adaptability and shameless intellectual flexibility, found himself taking notes during lectures given by beings he had once dismissed as primitively emotional. The transformation was complete when the Academy's newest recruitment materials began advertising their practitioner-focused curriculum, developed in consultation with galaxy-renowned combat specialists. The marketing department had carefully avoided mentioning that their star consultant was the same human they had dismissed for academic incompetence. Chen herself rarely visited the campus, but when she did, she maintained the same neutral expression that had characterized her time as a student. She offered polite consultations, delivered thoroughly professional training sessions, and collected fees that would have funded small planetary governments. During one of her rare visits, junior Archivist X, now promoted to senior academic coordinator, approached her with a question that had been troubling them since the whole affair began. "Miss Chen," Thex asked, their crystalline features cycling through colors indicating respectful curiosity, "why did you enroll at the Academy in the first place? You clearly didn't need the education." Chen considered the question for a moment, watching through the observation deck's transparent walls as current students practiced tactical exercises based on battles she had actually fought. "Entertainment value, mostly," she said finally. "I'd heard the Academy was teaching human warfare as an example of how not to fight. I was curious to see how they'd managed to get it so wrong." She paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I have to admit, it exceeded my expectations." Thex's color patterns shifted to what Chen had learned indicated profound philosophical confusion. "But you failed every simulation." "I failed their simulations," Chen corrected gently. "The actual battles had different outcomes." She gestured toward the training areas below, where alien students were now learning tactics she had developed during some of the most challenging conflicts of her career. "Besides," she added, "failing their version of my own battles was the most educational experience I've had in years. It taught me that there was a significant market opportunity for reality-based military consulting." Chen collected her consulting fee, submitted her monthly training curriculum updates, and departed for her next contract, a situation involving territorial disputes in the Outer Rim that had been declared theoretically unresolvable by several prestigious military think tanks. As her transport disappeared into hyperspace, the Academy's communication system chimed with an incoming message from the Galactic Defense Coordination Office. They were pleased to report that conflicts resolved using Chen methodology had resulted in a 347% improvement in successful outcomes compared to traditional academic approaches. The message concluded with a request for Chen Security Consulting to expand their educational programs to include additional military academies throughout the galaxy. In her former classroom, Professor Vextharan was preparing his afternoon lecture on urban warfare tactics, using source materials that had been thoroughly fact-checked against actual combat records. His lesson plan included a detailed analysis of the defense of New Jakarta, now properly credited as a decisive human victory achieved through innovative tactical thinking. As he arranged his notes, he reflected on the profound irony that the galaxy's most prestigious military academy had been teaching warfare to the very people who had perfected it, using sanitized versions of their own victories as examples of failure. The universe, it seemed, had an excellent sense of humor. It also, apparently, had a rather pointed opinion about institutional arrogance. And somewhere in the Outer Rim, Chen was probably having the last laugh while charging premium rates to solve conflicts that academic theorists had declared impossible, using methods she had learned not from textbooks, but from the considerably more reliable teacher of practical experience. The galaxy's military education system would never be quite the same. Which was, by all accounts, exactly as it